and give the word back to Thomas Philip.
Hello, everybody. Greetings from Berkeley, California. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to many of you in different parts of the world. It was good to scroll through the pages and see so many faces that I recognized. Wish we were in person, and many of you that I haven't had a chance to meet. Wish we could have had the opportunity to have this in person and meet you in person as well. But on behalf of my co-organizer, Lucy Avraamidou, and my co-panelists, Arshad Ali, Ananda Marin, Isabel Martins, Miwa Takeuchi, Natalie Davis, Audrey Msimanga, and Shirin Vasogi, we would like to welcome you to this session entitled Expanding Conceptions of Learning, Colonialism, Social Movements, and Possible Futures. What we'd like to do in this session is consider those elements of the learning sciences that might be the edges of the learning sciences in some ways. Yet we'd also like to invite this audience and our participants here to think about the ways in which these notions and constructs of colonialism, social movements, and possible futures are also central and core to what we do as researchers of learning. I'd briefly like to introduce this session by talking about how we came together. So a number of months ago, Lucy and I started to have a conversation around a larger invited panel that was focused on the broader theme of social justice. Given our conversations, we were inclined to think more deeply about questions around colonialism and social movements in particular. With those core constructs at the center, we invited the amazing panelists that you will hear today to be in conversation about what we mean by learning in relationship to colonialism and social movements and possible futures. What I'd love to also stress about this group is that it has been a process that has been reinvigorating, and it's been a process that has reminded me of how important it is about how we do our work, as much as it is in terms of the ideas that we generate and how we engage those ideas. I had the privilege of working with this amazing group of people over the last at least 3 months, where we met nearly every week. And so we were together in conversation over the course of these 3 months, in deep conversation, to think about how we share our ideas. And part of emphasizing the deepening of our own thinking was to emphasize the notion of learning from each other, from hearing each other, from listening to each other, to consider the ways in which our own joint construction of meaning transcended anything that we do individually, but what was our collective effort? It was our collective notions. And what struck me about this group is the ways in which people came together to deeply hear and learn from each other, to put their perspectives in dialogue with each other, to see, again, what the edges of the field might be, and how might we bring those to the core of the field. One of the key prompts that animated the rest of our time together was this particular question, and that was, how would the study of learning and/or disciplinary learning change or expand if it's centered in analysis of colonialism, social movements, and possible futures? How have you thought about pushing these boundaries and expansion? Okay. And so part of the process here was for us to think about our own work and how it sits in relationship with the work of our colleagues. We engaged in a longer process where we wrote out our responses to these prompts, and over the weeks that we met together, read each other's prompts, discussed each other's prompts and see what, and to look at what collective knowledge, what collective understandings we could generate from being in dialogue. What we'd like to do today is share some of our learnings from over the course of these last few months. The process that we're going to engage in is focused on paired discussions. So what we will be doing is working in pairs. We will engage in a discussion of the themes and ideas that came up over the course of our dialogue. These paired discussions will be introduced by a minute and a half, approximately, by each of the panelists. And after they introduce their introductory remarks, they will engage in a rather organic discussion to think about themes across their own presentations or their own talking points, as well as the themes that emerged across the course of our conversations. We are stressing here that we want this to be organic because these ideas are still emerging, and we want to share the tensions, the edges, and even the possible contradictions that exist within the spaces that we're exploring. We will follow each of these paired discussions by a 2-minute follow-up from any of the panelists, and we will go through four iterations of these paired discussions. Afterwards, we'll move into a discussion amongst panelists to again think about which sort of themes arose, what remaining questions, what kind of ideas would we want to draw out in terms of hearing each other in this space again. And finally, open it up to discussion with the audience. If you do have questions, what we are asking is that you please do write them in the chat, and they'll be taken up when we open it up to the larger conversation. So the themes for this the paired discussions will be starting off with a theme of colonial histories and materiality that will be introduced by Miwa and Arshad. We will move into a discussion of power, identity, and science by Lucy and Isabel. Then we'll move into a discussion of learning, freedom, and agency by Audrey and Natalie, and close with a conversation of criticality, ethical relations, and possible worlds by Ananda and Shireen. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Miwa and Arshad.
Arshad, would you like to start?
Sure. Hi. Thank you. Thank you, Thomas, for introducing the panel and for the invitation to participate in this conversation. It's been just a wonderful experience for me to work with this group over the past few months. And thank you all for coming and being present for us thinking aloud and kind of thinking through some ideas collectively. And I won't preface too long because I only have a short amount of time. So thinking about this question of colonialism and possible, or what I might think about as impossible futures, I consider how we account for what Avery Gordon has described as the ghosts that haunt our historic present. So a question I'm moved by in this conversation is how history is both inflected and reflected in the present. And I'm wondering how we can see histories. And by history, I'm particularly referencing settler colonialism and racial capitalism in this moment, but how we can see that history in our present of neoliberal modernity, but also how these histories limit what is possible, not just politically, but also how they limit what's possible to express or to even imagine. So then some questions I'm kind of struggling with and I'm working through is how then do we understand moment to moment human interaction, as well as understand the possibility of imagining futures in light of what is made possible and what is made impossible by our historic present, by the history that creates and structures our contemporary circumstance. So in this, I'm interested in exploring what is visible, what is erased, and potentially what is rendered unseeable or unstable by our contemporary political circumstance. So some of the questions I bring to this conversation are, how do our tools of research render particular realities unknowable and also invalid? And how do our tools of research not simply not see, but erase the historical from the knowable field? How are the intangibles of history, the ghosts, for example, how are they rendered non-existent by our tools of social research? And I'll pause there and kind of hand it over to Miwa to share some of her thoughts.
Thank you so much, Arshad. And I echo your appreciation to this group and Thomas and Lucy for correcting us. I learned through the process to voice from the place of love. So thank you so much for that, everyone. And Arshad, your framing of history as ghosts and our group's collective reframing of ghosts as more than haunting help us to see the agentive nature of history. Indeed, history is agentic and animate rather than fixed and inanimate. Take the discipline of STEM, for example. The ghosts who know the colonial pain in embodied ways can be less seen and less welcomed. My relationship with science and technology and mathematics have always been with the ghosts that my grandmother, who was a nurse during the World War II, vividly described for me and repeatedly. Bodies in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that were killed by abuse of the most advanced technology and scientific discovery back then. Can we see and listen to those ghosts when we learn STEM? How about ghosts that both human and inhuman on the seas of the Pacific and on the Native American territories that suffered from nuclear tests? Can the Orient and the other that Edward Said talks about be the ghost to be seen? Can we see the bodies of Palestinian children violently killed by military technology when we learn STEM? And as Spivak asked, can the subaltern speak in the disciplinary space? And this also connects to the question, who is a learner? Who is imagined as a learner in our scholarship? In particular, in STEM education, the discipline has historically positioned economic development and national security at its core. What if learners are learning to become more and more dispensable and replaceable by learning STEM? Can our scholarship liberate learners and learning from such frames imposed on them? And I'll stop there and I'd like to ask Arshad.
Thank you, Miwa. The comments you began with, they're illuminating, they're horrifying, and they're sobering. They remind us of some of the material realities of particular forms of STEM learning, the reality of the military as being kind of central to this. I wonder how we take from this conversation about these ghosts, and I think about even where you and I are both kind of our own historic, kind of personal, familial historic experiences, but also the places in which we find ourselves doing our work. Yourself being in Canada, myself being in the United States, and how these ghosts we think about are differently, or do you see them as differently present or wholly present in the spaces that we're working because of the disciplines we work in?
Right, that's such a good question. Because in methodology, for the sake of keeping the privacy, for example, when I work in the school contexts, I eliminated the name of the schools that carried the historical legacy of settler colonialism, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism. But by eliminating the materiality that those learners are learning, are we doing some erasure to our epistemology? So I wondered about that tension. What, as you posed very you proposed such a provocative question that what do we render visible and what do we render invisible through our own methodology?
No, I think that's, I mean, I think that what you're pointing towards, even kind of making the name of the schools, erasing those from our record. I wonder what we account for and what our data can actually see. So when I think about myself as someone who does both video and audio based research, like many of us in this room, the video and the audio are a certain archive. And I wonder what can be included in that archive, but what is also both purposefully and non-purposefully erased from existing in the contemporary with what we can see. Like I think of the name of the school, that may not appear in the video record.
Right.
But that may also appear in the record, right? It may be on the walls. But there's a certain way in which there can be almost a collective choice to erase that from the record, from the participants and ourselves. And I wonder how we participate in and we're culpable in the erasure of particular histories.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like when we see that thing, history, I feel we are always in this tension. As Chris Gutierrez said, learning to see historically should be intertwined with learning to imagine new futures. So to me, that seeing the what's hidden, what's rendered invisible, meant that how can we collectively design spaces those historically hidden bodies are no longer subjugated? And how can we queer disciplines that discipline our bodies? And also it meant to me that centralizing anti-colonial love that sees the pain of colonial violence and take collective action with communities. So I feel like those tensions, seeing the colonial violence and history, but taking that and to create historically anew is a unique place that the learning science is in, I feel.
I'm excited to continue this conversation. I think we need to pause now to open up for a dialogue.
So we have 2 minutes if any of the panelists want to jump in and add any short comments or flag a question that we'd want to take up in the later session.
I'll just bring up a quick question, Thomas. I heard both Miwa and Arshad talking about learning is happening in the moment to moment of interaction and how we use our methodologies to study those moments, and what new tools we might need to better understand what gets erased. And for me, I think they also raised a possibility of what it looks like to use our methods to engage in healing practices and how we think about repairing damage that can sometimes happen in the moment to moment of interactions.
Thank you for bringing up healing, Ananda.
I'm reminded of the conversations we've had over the course of the last few months and in terms of thinking about colonial histories and materiality in relationship to the very question of knowability, and that occurred throughout the course of our discussions that I hope to elevate in our larger discussions as well. We will move to Lucy and Isabel's discussion of power, identity, and science. Arshad, Audrey has come in, so if you could make her a co-host, that would be wonderful.
Yes, I will do that. Thank you. Okay, give me 1 minute. I have to do this 1 second.
In the meantime, Lucy and Isabel, would you like to start us off?
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you everyone for joining us. So Isabel and I explore a set of interrelated questions that relate to issues of power, identity, and science in our unique context. The Netherlands, where I currently live, a country that hasn't deeply engaged with its colonial past, not yet at least, and Brazil, where Isabel is based in. So to do that, we examine issues related to racism, sexism, colonialism, elitism, classism, and power in science and science education, both in school and in out-of-school settings. So some of the questions that we engage with are the following: who is allowed in science? Who is considered as a legitimate producer of scientific knowledge? Who is constructed as an insider or outsider in science? Who is recognized and who is made vulnerable? And lastly, what kinds of identities are deemed in and or outside of place in science? So in examining these questions, our overarching goal is to disrupt current conceptualizations of the nature of science as a practice for scientists and bring forward the idea of science for the people. Now I invite Isabel to share some of the main constructs that we'll be discussing.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. Well, thanks twice for inviting me to take part in the panel and for your comments as well. I think it's quite important that we think about these connections, because we are very much, we're getting used to linear connections to be made between science education, inclusion, social justice. And when Lucy argues for the need to disrupt specific conceptualizations of the nature of science, and when I ask you to think more critically about the relationships between scientific literacy and issues like democratic participation and decision-making in society, what we are trying to say is that it's important to think about science as something which is done by people who are not necessarily white or heterosexual, middle-class men, in a sort of isolated, culture-free environment. So there are issues that have to do with this idea of who can be a scientist, who cannot be a scientist, who's allowed in or out science and scientific practice. And in our work, I think it has materialized in terms of questions that have to do with the nature of social practices in which science is involved in, but also in the opportunities for some groups in society, such as women, Black, Indigenous people, etc. So in our case, it involves thinking about school as a place where it is possible to create an ethos for these groups to engage in science, but not just through mimicking scientific activity, but through establishing relationships between people and society in a way that helps deconstruct stereotypes and helps position people in different ways, which are related to scientific discourse. And the importance of schooling is utmost, because it's a social practice that enables people to access other social practices. So that's why we have thought about that. We also think that it's impossible to dissociate the issue of nature of science and scientific literacy from a discussion about discourse and how discourse positions people in society, how the use of discourse ends up constructing who's deemed as trustworthy, vulnerable, authorized, non-authorized to participate in science, but also thinks that these positions, which are constructed discursively, involves disputes, and they involve the construction of ideological categorizations, but they are contestable, and their dynamics is open to study and to scrutiny. So I think in the same way, there is an agenda for both research and practice connecting nature of science and scientific literacy. There's a need for them to be disrupted. We also need to think about these definitions of who scientific literate people are. What do they do in terms of a more in terms of other different analogies. Scientific literate a person must not be connected to a scientist necessarily, but to what Isabelle Stanger and Peter Fensham call a connoisseur, for example, in an analogy with the context of the wine culture. Well, I may enjoy drinking wine, and I may know which wines I like and which wine I like best when I have a certain type of food, but I'm not a sommelier or a winemaker. So it means that the issue of literacy cannot be disconnected from personal histories, but also from social cultural contexts. And I think Lucy can tell us a little bit of about the work she's been doing in the Netherlands. And if there's time, I'll comment about one or two things.
Yeah, thank you, Isabel. So yeah, to kind of make these ideas a bit more concrete, I'm going to share a brief example of the work that my team and I are trying to do in the Netherlands. So we designed an after-school STEAM program for parents and children that have a Caribbean background, that they self-identify as Dutch Caribbean. So this is a Saturday morning program which is framed around culturally relevant pedagogies and has a focus on identity, specifically the construct of recognition, meaning how these children and parents are recognized by other experts or by other members of their communities, by scientists and so on. So what's unique about this program is that we engage everyone in a kind of a co-construction of the curriculum. We have a big team of artists, scientists, the parents and the students, the young children as well, are engaged in designing science investigations around interest. So in conceptualizing this study or this program, I draw upon what I call identity as a landscape of becoming, and I use this kind of a metaphor to emphasize the role of place or the characteristics of the socio-political context on young children and families' engagement with science or disengagement with science. So in doing so, we're trying to put in practice these constructs or ideas that Isabel and I have been discussing in the past 3 months. Identity, who is recognized as a competent scientist or who is not recognized as a competent scientist. Issues related to power and essentially issues related to how we conceptualize the nature of science, who is allowed in and who is left outside. Thomas, I'm looking at you, or I'm trying to look at you. I think we're close to the time, for 2 minutes.
Yes, we have about a minute left. If you, either of you have any concluding remarks.
Yeah, perhaps a concluding remark, because I come from a unique context as a country, as I said earlier, the Netherlands is, as other countries in Europe, unlike the US, they haven't really engaged deeply with their colonial past, and that is evident both in the curriculum, in school curriculum, as well as the university. So, however, this has been changing in the past couple of years, especially with the Black Lives Movement. We've seen some changes or some trends in our context as well. So we're hoping that this is kind of, the movement has created some kind of a momentum for some changes to happen in science education as well.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Isabel. And thank you for the reminder. Again, the geographical diversity also represented in this panel in terms of scholars from North America, but also the Netherlands and Brazil and South Africa. And it's been, I think, this one of the strengths of the conversations in terms of thinking about place and the particularities of histories. So I just, again, want to open it up to the other panelists if there are key ideas or connections people would want to put forward at this time.
Yeah, I think I have something. I'm not sure. This is one of those comments. I'm not sure if it's a question, if it's a comment, but I'll try to work my way through it. But I'm making some connections between Miwa and Arshad and then what Lucy and Isabel just shared with us, and particularly like the idea of thinking about science as a social practice. And when we think about like science and science education or STEAM in a very normative sense, like they readily take up ideas around bodies and materials, like that is a part of normative kind of science education, but certainly not in the ways that Miwa and Arshad were talking about bodies or materiality. But perhaps, I think part of what we're working with in this group is, but perhaps they should, perhaps the domains should be taking up these ideas in more expansive ways. And so I guess I'm just thinking about like how those ideas of kind of reimagining the domain of science and kind of co-constructing the idea of science, like in relation to one another, how that might connect to these ideas of thinking about bodies and materials in ways that are very different than the ways that I think they're taken up at present. So I don't know if this is that's just a thought that I have. I don't even know if we have time to dig into that.
I have a related thought, Natalie, that I'll just share and maybe we can come back to, which is that I think there's this kind of tension or contradiction around the fact that the kinds of scientific practices that are typically kind of Western, more narrow practices that take on a kind of epistemic supremacy within our field, and maybe we could say the same thing about some methodologies, often get cast as more rigorous. And this conversation is making me think about how the erasures and the constraints on knowledge making are actually preventing us from understanding the fullness of phenomena. And I'm kind of thinking about the ways that when we bring these phenomena into view, there's often a reaction that that's not what's rigorous. And so I just think that terrain of discourse is important to disentangle, because I think what you all are asking us to think about is what it would look like to engage with the full complexity and history of the phenomena that we're looking at.
Well, thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Shadeen. And with that, we'll move to our third theme on learning, freedom, and agency. Natalie and Audrey.
Do we have Audrey? I don't know why I'm not.
Yes. Okay.
Hi, Audrey. I don't know why I can't see you, but I'm sure I'll see you shortly. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. And I think I want to echo, the sentiment that this has really been a phenomenal opportunity to co-think. And I think for me personally, just as a junior scholar who is relatively new to the learning sciences, I think at least in a formal sense, that I've really appreciated the ways that our conversations have pushed my work and encouraged me to pursue lines of research that further lean into these questions of agency and freedom. So I am an educational ethnographer. I study children's self-determination and their socio-political sense-making. My work has wrestled with these tensions with how childhood, and in particular Black childhood, gets constructed as this developmental place of unknowing, but also to some extent to freely imagine, but not necessarily a place or space to freely act, to assess, to critique, or transform. My work asks questions of learning environments, especially those that seek to advance justice. What kinds of freedom are nourished here? What does it look like and feel like for children on multiple scales and across contexts? And what are the implications in these spaces for what it means to know and to be civic actors? And one of the things that I'm wondering today, and that's been a part of our ongoing conversations, is how the learning sciences conceptualizes and foregrounds studies of freedom and agency that consider things like ancestral wisdom, collective practices of dreaming, of resistance, of reclamation, these things that have emerged from non-dominant communities. And do we do a good job in the field of seeing how buds of development that are resonant with these practices might emerge from children in the everyday? And with that, I'll stop there and turn it over to Audrey.
Thank you, Natalie. Hello, everyone. My name is Audrey Msimanga. I work at Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. I've been in teacher education for more than 20 years, and my research has focused mainly on looking at the teaching and learning of science in multilingual contexts. So my interest is how learners make sense of science in these contexts and what they bring into the classroom and how that impacts on or influences whether and how they learn science. So that has been the core of my research so far. And some of the questions I'm asking relate to learner resilience in these contexts. But in the conversations in the past few weeks, in the discussions with the panel, the issue of agency has really come to the fore for me as something that I would like to explore in this context and see how it plays out. And so, you know, what different forms of agency play out in these contexts. And for me as a teacher educator, for my students as potential teachers, but also for their learners in the classroom. What are the forms of agency? And what is the role of these different forms of agency in not only in enabling learning, but also in ways of empowering learners in general? So yes, I do look forward to discussing these issues in this session tonight. And Natalie and I have been talking back and forth around really raising questions more than providing answers. Questions around conceptions of freedom and agency. Just for us to think through what we mean with these words. What does freedom mean? What is agency? We throw these words around quite a lot: agency, autonomy, empowerment, freedom. Often these words are referenced but not fully defined. And as a result, there are many working conceptions of these words. And some of these conceptions are actually at odds or in conflict with each other. So our thinking is a need to further nuance and concretize definitions of these words so as to better attend to our students' context and particularly children's subjective experiences. A need to think through the implications for children in the ways that we conceptualize and use these words. How should these definitions that we use, how do they impact the children? What are the applications of these words that derive from the way we define them? And what do we bring into the space ourselves, which then informs how we define and apply these words? So just to think through what is often assumed about the learner and learning and how this shapes conceptions of learning. What are the implications for schooling, for instance? So I quite like Haraway's words. for us to think about challenging the ideas that we use to think about ideas. And in this case, to challenge the ideas that we use to think about learners and learning, so that our learners don't become just another brick in the wall. Natalie, I'll give over to you, perhaps to just go back to how we can think about complicating the notions of freedom.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things, Audrey, that you have helped us to think about in our group as it relates to agency and freedom is just how these ideas and conceptions don't always translate across spaces and places and time. And so thinking about what it means to be agentic in the context of family or community can look very different than what it means to be agentic in a particular classroom context, or how that could vary across schooling contexts or across learning environments. And so in this idea of needing to have sort of added more specificity around kind of how these different conceptions of freedom and agency may be at play, different assumptions about what that means, what that looks like, how that should feel for young people, and also considering how these things may be at odds across spaces in ways that are important for us to note, important for us to study, and important for us to think about how we might move forward. I think also related to how we might complicate these notions of freedom and justice is I think that there is this conception or maybe misconception that when we say a word like freedom, to be free, that the way that we're talking about it, at least in the context like of our group or in the context of educational environments, is that it's anything goes, that we're talking about moving toward these scenarios where anything goes. And that's not, that's not the ideas that we're advancing, particularly when we're saying that we care about things like having a justice-oriented focus and moving toward particular ends in society. That the type of freedom that we're talking about is always having a consideration of the collective, of how individuals and the collective are related at all times, that it's not about having free reign and doing whatever you want, because you could be free in a way that would advance sort of oppressive regimes. You could be free in a way that would advance imperialism. And that is not the kind of freedom that we're talking about or moving toward. And so, you know, this is just one of the ideas that have come up in our work of thinking about particular forms of freedom and agency, and being very specific about what it is that we're moving toward, and why looking more closely at social movements and how those practices have emerged over time in terms of thinking about what that might look like to move toward freedom in particular ways at different levels. What does that look like in the everyday? What does that look like on the macro, at a macro level? And what's the interplay between kind of the everydayness of moving toward these things and also these larger ideas and ideals that we're moving toward? Where are we, Thomas, with time? I didn't really know when we started.
We're right about to wrap up, so yeah. Okay. So thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Audrey. Just again, wanted to open it up to the panelists to flag any questions, to raise any, to make connections to their own themes before we move into the final theme.
Perhaps I should say just a comment on these ways, different ways through which agency may either refract or reflect more structural aspects in society, have a little bit to do with the kinds of expectations that we have from schooling. One of the examples of the things that we have been doing with our group in Brazil is to look at connections between structural racism in Brazilian society and scientific racism. So this idea that that there is a moment in which sort of a rationale for classification escapes biology and enter a social, cultural, political domain. And the extent, and to what extent have we constructed that as an educational problem? And to what extent we as educators, as agents of the schooling process, can sort of reframe the discussion about structural racism in society, the relationships between structural racism in society and scientific racism, for example, the scientific basis of the study of race. So I think there is this dialectics between structure and agency is a very important point for us to consider, and sort of what Natalie and Audrey said sort of provoked me in that sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that there's something especially powerful about thinking about the relationship between institutions and then children's agentic behavior, but doing it alongside studies of colonialism, anti-Blackness, imperialism, kind of these larger structural issues that have been a part of our everyday lives, have been a part of our histories and our society. And to not separate these ideas and tensions that we may be having around what does it mean to support students' agency, and to sort of assume that there's a connection and there are parallels between some of the tensions that we may be experiencing, whether it be in a schooling context or in other settings, and some of these larger issues that we have around structure and agency and individuals, and how to affirm and what we're moving toward socially in a larger sense. That there's kind of this, well, this is a schooling issue and this is a societal issue, but kind of seeing those things as always kind of reifying and reinforcing one another.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Isabel, for that question and connection. Let us move to our final theme, criticality, ethical relations, and possible worlds. Shireen and Ananda.
Thanks, Thomas, and everyone. I'm so grateful to be in this dialogue, and especially to get a chance to talk with my dear colleague and sister Ananda about this theme. So I'll just say a few kind of overarching ideas and then pass it to Ananda. So I think that as these ideas around the political and the ethical dimensions of learning get kind of taken up and worked on in the field, that I've been thinking a lot about how the tools for carefully noticing the reproduction of power and coloniality within learning environments and interactions are necessary but distinct from the tools that allow us to see what becomes possible in moment-to-moment interactions and over longer arcs of time in more transformative environments and experiences. And I think I'm having a meta moment here based on all the other conversations, which is that I think that there's this part of the reason it's so important to enliven and support these dialogues wherever we are is that when there is not space for naming clearly the ghosts of history and their present manifestations, as well as the political dimensions of social life, then we are pigeonholed to be asserting that those things are real, as opposed to also having the space to really talk in the ways that we've had a chance to talk with each other, because those values are shared and presumed about what we mean by freedom, about, you know, as Natalie was saying and Audrey was sharing, and what could be possible. And so the way that I've been thinking about this with others is kind of sometimes this imbalance between criticality and social dreaming, to borrow from Manuel Espinosa's term, or maybe to say that if we emphasize too much the political and not enough the ethical, we can cut off the space, I think, for new design and pedagogical and ethical imagination. And this is a deep lesson for me that I've learned from my own family history in the context of Iran, as well as from working closely with colleagues like Megan Bang, about how, as educators and researchers, when we engage in routine forms of design and documentation and reflection, how we can learn to sense and notice the shifting ground that becomes possible through particular designs, and that allows us to see kind of new horizons of possibility. And this resonates, I think, with ideas about collective zones of proximal development and utopian methodologies. And I think that this is kind of, for me, like one of the places where radical hope lives in this conversation, is that our methodologies and our attunements actually allow us to see the relationships between human learning and social change over various scales of time. And so I'll pause there and pass it to Ananda, but those are some of the things that I've been thinking about.
Thanks, sis. I want to just take a moment to note how special it feels to be in this space with all of you, and to say how much I appreciate just the generosity that everyone shared in our discussions and willing to be open in our conversations and dialogues. Reflecting on our conversations, I'm reminded that I take as given that settler colonial ideologies based in human, non-human binaries continue to operate today in the everyday fabric of life in what is now known as the United States. I also recognize that how people see, hear, and feel the weavings of settler colonialism is uneven. Through my relations with my mentors, both those inside and outside of the academy, I've attuned my own professional vision and am practiced at recognizing how settler colonial logics produce knowledge and structures through coding and highlighting phenomena in ways that take shape materially and ideologically in the disciplines. And even though I'm skilled at doing this, it's not a skill that is equally valued across contexts. And while I work within settler colonial structures, they do not define the core of who I am. I've also been mentored to attune my professional vision to freedom dreams, elsewheres, that are not enclosed by settler colonial imaginaries. And I labor to actively code and highlight the world in transformative ways so that I do not have to dwell in a territory whose existence is dependent upon my erasure. And as a researcher, I think about how these practices of seeing through settler colonial time and seeing through indigenous time have implications for the methodologies we use to study and design transformative learning contexts. Professional vision that supports seeing settler colonial structures can help us to understand how deficit knowledges are produced. However, seeding and planting these practices may not always serve. Participatory design research and interaction analysis, two methodologies that I draw on, invite scholars to trace histories of social relations for the purposes of understanding how action is built. PDR also asks that we imagine possible worlds and then enact practices today that shape our collective futures. I use both methodologies to better understand the relational and socio-ecological dimensions of human maturation and to collectively design conditions for Indigenous education and resurgence. So today I'd like to bring forward Glenn Coulthard's and Leanne Simpson's concept of grounded normativity, which refers to ethical frameworks from Indigenous land-based practices that teach us to live in respectful, reciprocal diplomatic relations. Grounded normativity goes beyond land acknowledgements and asks something different from us. From my perspective, one of the asks is what the field of education or learning sciences can learn from Indigenous education and how we might engage in this learning process in ways that are mutually beneficial and reciprocal rather than assimilative and extractive. I'm going to pass it back to you, Shireen.
Thanks, Ananda. I'm just going to offer a reflection and then ask maybe a question, which the reflection is about my own thinking over time. And I think Natalie brought forward this question of how we think about children and their relationship with the dialogue that we're having. And I think many of us share kind of a history and interest in different forms of political education. And I think one of the questions that's become really pressing for me is how a kind of space for critical social analysis with young people is necessary but insufficient. And I find myself, as I work with educators and others, especially newer educators who are coming into this work, really asking questions about what is nourishing, especially for young people who come from histories of racialized violence and settler colonialism in their communities. And so I think that question of nourishment in the present is tied to how we're thinking about the imagination of possible futures in the here and now. And also to your point earlier about healing, Ananda. And my question for you, because we've been in conversation for a long time, is that I think there's like resonances between us about themes of relationality, about questions of time and temporality, I think we're both drawn to moment interactional methodologies, and also to questions of movement in our own ways and how we conceptualize movement. So my question, as we kind of round out this piece, is how do you see those phenomena as connected to your deeper kind of educational and political projects that you see yourself as a part of?
Well, the first part of your reflection, Shireen, I think reminds me, and I think Natalie also reminds me of this, that young children are fairly adept at engaging in critical social analysis. And so, I think that there's a tension in the field of education, in the field of psychology, in the field of learning sciences about the subject matter and the content in discourse and dialogue with young children, and what are the spaces that we can enter with young children. And so I want to hold up that the young children that I've worked with, whether they're 5-year-olds or 14-year-olds or 21-year-olds, I think in their own ways are really adept at engaging in critical social analysis. And at the same time, I think what they're asking for, what they're inviting adults to co-design with them, is spaces where they have a sense of agency, where they have a sense of freedom, where they're in an intergenerational, multi-generational, multi-species community. And so for me, that those spaces that we design are intimately tied to larger ideas of movement and mobilities. And, both of us have worked with Megan Bang. And I think part of what we have always been after is how do we design for those moment-to-moment interactions that reach both backward into our ancestral wisdom and knowledge, and reach forward, recognizing that we are also creators today of ancestral wisdom and knowledge, that we are not static historical actors. And so I guess for me, this is bringing me to a question for you, and one of your recent papers about ethical trails and pathways, and how you're thinking about how we can push methodologies to better understand and to see the ethical.
Thank you for that. I feel like there's lots of directions we can go with that, but I in that work, I think I was really struck, to your point too, about how adept young children are at attuning to the ethical and being concerned with the ethical in learning environments and in their interactions with others, and skilled, I think, at picking up on the modeling of different kinds of ethical relations that they might pick up with one another. And so trying to understand that at different timescales, and also thinking about it as a kind of intergenerational learning where we have something, I think, to learn from their keen attunement. And then I've also been thinking about it over much longer arcs of time. So thinking about, for example, for me in a recent project like parenting within the Iranian left, and how leftists parented, and how those forms of parenting have actually shaped future generations' activity in really interesting and perhaps sometimes unanticipated ways over decades, in a way that I think is a different time scale of questions around ethical relationality and those trails, but I think it's such a powerful set of phenomena for us to try to better understand and attune to, because it means that what gets introduced in design and what gets mobilized within moment-to-moment interaction, as you were talking about, has resonance over long arcs of time that I think we're beginning to understand in different ways. So I'll pause there. I know there's a lot more to talk about with that, and I'm imagining that we may need to come back to the whole group. So I'll look to Thomas for that.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you, Ananda. And thank you, everyone, for your powerful reflections and sharing insights into the larger themes that we've been discussing over these last few months. In our remaining time, what I'd like to do is open up a space for the panelists to be in dialogue with each other initially. And we will also have time for questions from the larger group of participants. So if you do have questions that you would like to engage the panelists with, please do enter them into the Q&A portion of the WOA app, and we will take those up in just a few minutes. Again, we've walked through a number of different themes for our sessions, and given the range of themes that we engaged with, I just want to quickly remind us of the 4 themes that we've talked through. We started off with Miwa and Arshad thinking through colonial histories and materiality, and then Lucy and Isabel helped us think about power, identity, and science. Audrey and Natalie engaged questions around learning, freedom, and agency, and Ananda and Shireen engaged us in questions around criticality, ethical relations, and possible worlds. To start off our conversation, what I'd like to do is go back to a question that Natalie and Shireen posed in between. And that was a question of how do we make visible and how do we study the fullness of our phenomenon? And how do we study and make visible the fullness of learning, particularly given the context of coloniality, our colonial histories, and the possibilities of social futures and possible worlds?
I'll offer something. So as you were asking that question, Thomas, it reminded me of how many people on our panel today and people that I know that are listening to us are working with artists. And so I do think that working with scholars across disciplines is one way for us to learn to shift what we're tuning to and to see in new ways. I also wonder, so there's a power in making visible the fullness of phenomena, but I'm reminded of Indigenous scholars' work around research as ceremony. And I'd also like to put out there that there are some phenomena that might be protected that we don't want to make visible. So there's a multiplicity there that I think is important to understand and to delve into.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ananda, for bringing up the point about how knowledge and power are entangled. As Foucault said, knowledge is / power. So I think there are certain, although myself, I feel like because of my ontology, very much rooted in my ontology, I'm drawn to what is hidden and what people are actively hiding in the colonial institutional learning space. But I'm careful that there are spaces that should be sacred, and there are knowledge that I shouldn't have to access. I don't have the right to access. So I feel like to see the colonial history in our data is to really acknowledge and really reflect on who am I to know this phenomenon, and who do I have to seek the permission for me to learn what is rendered as invisible.
Miwa, in hearing your comments, it's making me think about what the purposes are of rendering particular things visible, and for what benefit. I've thought about this a little in my own work when I was working with youth activists who were organizing strategies to evade visibility by the police, and to make those practices visible to a wider public. For me, I initially began the project thinking that's part of what I would be doing. but in kind of continued and deeper conversations with the young people, one of the things that became abundantly clear to me was they already knew these practices. They didn't need anyone else to share them with. So to share them with a larger community only makes them increasingly vulnerable. So, so in hearing your comments, it kind of takes me back to what many of our teachers have taught, myself and many of us, about research as being work done for those whom you're engaging with. And then a secondary outcome is for kind of a larger scholarly audience. But if our research is not helping to improve the lives, improve the lots, improve giving people who we're working with access to new ways of knowing about their own selves and histories, we kind of make them the objects rather than the subjects of the project. And so your comments made me reflect on that idea.
You know, I was very much provoked by your comment, Miwa, because it seems to me that it explains very well why it's so difficult for us as researchers to have this sort of bird's eye view on the objects and the settings and scenarios that we are investigating. There's something to a good element of reflexivity to be put into the foreground, as it were, in order to deal with that. Thank you for bringing this idea.
If I can add to that, I'm not sure, not to sound like a pessimist, but I'm not sure, Thomas, that we will ever be able to fully understand the complexity and multiplicity of the self as a learner, or how we develop. But I think at least we can begin to challenge the physics theoretical frameworks and single dimensional and linear methodologies. So for me, that would be a starting point to gaining a more comprehensive understanding of the complexity and multiplicity of science and science learning, but without necessarily with the goal of fully understanding that.
I don't think it's your pessimism. I feel like that's your humility.
Thank you, Mira.
And to take the other side of that same question, what would rendering our colonial histories and colonial contexts make visible about learning that is more difficult or challenging for us to see now?
Thomas, will you ask the question again?
So Ananda, you helped us, or you reminded us to recognize that there are some things that should simply not be rendered visible, at least to in particular spaces, to particular audiences. And part of what brought us together was thinking about what does it mean to render our colonial histories and colonial contexts visible? And in doing so, how might our conceptions of learning change? What becomes evident in our conceptualization of learning that would have been out of our reach otherwise?
Mm-hmm. Well, Isabel, were you going to say something? Okay, so I'll just start by saying that I rely heavily on Gregory Cajete's work. Dr. Cajete is a Tewa scholar, and he defines education as socialization into the lifeways of a community. And so, and in the learning sciences, I think many of us think about learning as shifts in participation in communities of practice. So when we make colonialism visible, for me, the immediate question that comes up is, how are we creating contexts where young people and adults are continually asked to participate in practices that uphold colonial structures, right? And, in many ways, I think schooling is implicated in this. And so I try to make a distinction between schooling and education. And at the same time, young children spend a good portion of their days and adults spend a good portion of their days in schools, whether they're public schools or private schools or universities. And so I think at like the most basic level in the day-to-day and the moment-to-moment, when I reflect on my relationships with graduate students and universities that I think are increasingly calling for us to engage with multiple epistemologies and to have conversations about colonialism and settler colonialism and decolonization, that those conversations and those spaces create ruptures where we begin to see structures. And there's this constant, I think, push and pull in the everyday as we're in these spaces together about how in those ruptures, in those moments, we take action to engage in redesigning. And I think sometimes we pause and are able to do that together. And there are other moments when we decide to move along because the structures can feel so overwhelming that the effort to redesign actually has real consequences and costs to our bodies and our spirits. So for me personally, I think there's a balance between rendering colonialism visible and also rendering other practices like ancestral knowledge and wisdom visible, so that we can hold ourselves and carry ourselves in ways that allow us to continue dreaming towards a future that's not always shaped by resistance to harmful structures.
Thomas, can I come in?
Of course. Thank you, Audrey.
Right. So I think one of the difficulties is the complexity of the long histories. And I think it relates to the point about ghosts. And also thinking about what Natalie and I were discussing and seeing as the border crossing that learners need to do on a continual basis, and ways of being in the different spaces. So it becomes, I think it becomes quite a complex lifting from the situation and reflecting on it almost from outside, as if outside the situation. So I'll give you an example. In our context, something simple like language is heavily embroiled in this thinking about colonialism and how it plays out and how it has over time shaped institutions and how we work with learners. So one of the examples we discussed with Natalie was a case where in my home, we went to school and we're encouraged to go to school and we should study hard. But when we got back home, my mother would say clearly, you went to school to learn English. You speak English at school. This is my house. We don't speak English in this house. So what's needed in that case then is empowering the student or the learner to be able to cross these borders and still continue to be and function in the different spaces. So ultimately, you know, our learner should be able to work with the different kinds of knowledge, but with a full understanding of what these knowledges are, where they are coming from, and where there's a conflict between these knowledges, and what the impact is on their being as a human being. Thank you, Thomas. I'll stop there.
So Audrey's comments. Oh, I'm sorry, Shireen, were you going to jump in?
Go for it.
Thank you. Audrey, your comments really made me opened up a conversation in my own head and made me think about how young people's what are their epistemological orientation? And I think responding to Thomas's questions, their orientations towards what it means to know and communal notions of what it means to know and how one knows, as well as like what is a teacher and who is a teacher in young people's lives. And I think those are ways in which we can materially see how some of these histories of coloniality play out. And I think about Audrey's comment about the story about going to school to learn English. In some of my recent work, I've been trying to explore how students, what their orientations towards the institution of the school is. And in exploring that, one of the things I'm beginning to see with the young people I'm working with is that they're not imagining school as a place of freedom. They're not imagining school as a place of knowing oneself in a more whole way, but I think in ways that Audrey was pointing towards. The school is a place in which they get particular tools to make themselves viable within a capitalist economy that they understand is fundamentally antithetical to who and how they want to live their lives, but they're gaining particular material tools. And I wonder how even that orientation towards schooling, my initial reading kind of in the earlier phase of my life was, well, it's a really, it's a problematic reading of schooling, but in some ways I'm seeing as a much more liberatory relationship to the institution. Because they're seeing themselves as making agentic choices about what they want to take from these institutions and what they want to leave from them. So I wonder how some of those ways in which young people enact, relate, and participate within institutions shifts their own conceptions of learning as well, and how learning means very different things in very different spaces.
I just had a thought. I think there are a lot of ideas that are kind of swimming about in my head, but I was connecting your question, Thomas, to ideas around just the infrapolitical acts of learning and participation, and the ways that young people and people collectives like over time become very good at reading dynamics and reading situations and kind of knowing how to move and how to adjust in ways that may cover your tracks. So I'm thinking about Scott and thinking about Robin Kelly's work and thinking about how these are deeply intellectual and complex, like social and political and relational practices. And by sort of considering and kind of foregrounding, I guess, a colonial, like this presence that people are negotiating and navigating in ways in pursuit of individual and collective forms of thriving and becoming, that they are constantly like learning how the domain and how the circumstances shift and finding ways to navigate with a level of dexterity and ingenuity that's important for us to notice and recognize and see as models for thinking about what it means to learn and what it means to adjust and what it means to grow socially and also intellectually. And so I think that there are lots of lessons and models in that work that's constantly happening. within the context of communities or that individuals, whether it be children or not, that are learning at a very young age and developing these skill sets, that I think that there's a lot of potential and transformative potential in terms of lifting and honoring, lifting up these practices and thinking about how they might interact or might be at odds with some of our other theories or conceptions around learning, positive forms of learning and development.
Yeah, I'll just add, I really appreciate this conversation, and I'll just add that one of the words I'm wrestling with as I think with everybody is navigation. And the reason I'm wrestling with that word is because I think that there are really important realities of moving across contexts and knowledge systems and cultural practices that require the kinds of support that I think people are naming around navigation, or Arshad, what you're bringing up about kind of like a particular relationship with school that doesn't, you know, that puts it in its place as a kind of thing, pragmatics that may not be definitional for young people. And I also wonder, where do we open space for the reimagination and expansion of disciplines so that we're not only supporting young people to know how to do what's needed here and then engage in other practices, but to also think about, you know, the creativity that is possible. And so like, I'm just thinking about, because we've been talking a lot about STEM, I've been teaching writing in different contexts and thinking about how much, you know, undergraduates in the United States come to college with the idea that you can't use I in your writing. That's a big no-no. And, you know, we talk about, where does that idea come from? Who does it serve? And how do we think about that? And that doesn't prevent them from not using it where they need to, but it opens up a conversation about the intellectual history of the practices that they're socialized into, and a kind of more agentive relationship with what they want to take on and could create within, you know, from a view of kind of like genre bending and expansion. And I think there's a parallel question. We've been talking a lot about disciplinary knowledge and knowledge making, but I think there's parallel questions about relationality and which relational practices in learning environments are valued. Anybody who's tried to get rid of grades knows that there's anxieties that come with that, even if you're down with getting rid of grades. And there's conversations around like, what have we been taught about learning as individual property, as opposed to this more collective or communal process. And so I think, and the last thing I'll say kind of about your question, Thomas, is that I think as the field wrestles with what it means to be more meaningfully global, I think that there's a really interesting meta question for us here also about theories of learning and epistemologies of learning, and how, you know, we have our canon, and many parts of that canon I hold close to my heart, but similar to other fields that have engaged critically with what has been canonized, how do we kind of think about multiple epistemologies of learning across contexts as part of what comes into view when we take colonialism seriously.
So in the last few minutes we have, wanted to introduce a couple of questions from the audience. And so the first, I'm going to blend two of these questions together. And the first is, how do we reshape and reorient education, both in practice and research, when so much capital, time, and effort have been invested in these forms that perpetuate these historical ghosts? And that, in many ways, is related to the second question about how do we as a community repair and abolish epistemic supremacy?
I might start, but this is my unfinished thoughts. So hopefully the collective can lift this unfinished thoughts with me. But I'm struggling with this politics of translation, and go back to Natalie and Audrey's discussion about the politics of translation and the power of translation. And to release the learners from the racial capitalist economy is to change the economy to something else, so somewhere else, such as centering the gifting or centering the economy that's not grounded in capital exchange. And Amartya Sen talked about this idea in lieu of human capital. He proposed the idea of human capability, where the learners can lead the lives that lead to value. So, but his epistemology is rooted not in the West per se. So opening up the scholarship of learning sciences to the global level, we have to grapple with this politics of translation. And there will be always some spaces that lost in translation.
I think oh,
Sorry.
No, Isabel, you first.
No, that's okay. It's just half a thought as well. I was thinking in terms of how we deal with deconstructing epistemological supremacies in our practices. And I think this is not easy, especially in colonial backgrounds where we have faced what is frequently called epistemicide. I mean, the destruction of different languages and knowledge systems as a result of colonialization. And at the same time, we have, let's say, Western modern science as constitutive of our identities. So we have to struggle with that, and we have to deal with these ambivalences and contradictions, and hope they are going to be fertile places for new ideas. So I would say that I have seen a lot of examples whereby scholars and practitioners have invested in fostering the idea of epistemological pluralism as a possibility to deal with the idea that in schools, in teaching science in schools, we should at the same time reaffirm our commitment to the democratization of legitimate knowledge, which gives people access to many social practices, and at the same time reaffirm our respect to different knowledge systems without, well, God forbid, falling into relativism. So these, I think there is a field, a very important field to explore that concerns the relationships between epistemological pluralism and relativism, that can probably be fertile in the sense that provokes us to propose new possibilities of enacting practices and goals in classrooms and curriculum in general.
Yeah, I think I was thinking a little bit about the first question and about this idea of the immense amount of energy and capital that has been poured into kind of facilitating and helping to maintain this, what is our current schooling or educational kind of context. And it makes me think a little bit about how important it is to remember, and maybe this is something I'm reminding myself too, and I know that these concepts have come up in our conversations, how these systems also heavily rely on individuals in an everyday sense, kind of upholding these norms and these ideas. So maybe thinking a little bit about Foucault and some of the other things that we've talked about in our group. And it's interesting to me because I teach in a program of creative and innovative education. And one of the assignments that I work with mostly practicing teachers and teaching artists around is experiment in kind of thinking about their pedagogical and design philosophy, but a philosophy that does not in any way have to be pragmatic or something that they feel like they can actualize kind of in the present or even in the near future. Like sky is the limit in terms of dreaming about what might be possible in through your practice. And it's very interesting that a lot of the ideas that are supposed to be kind of these impossible ideas that are proposed by teachers are actually things to me that don't sound very difficult to implement at all. Like they sound like these are things that you actually could do in the present, or you could start to move toward, you know, these things in an everyday sense, even though maybe the way that they proposed them initially made them think that this is something that's very, very far in the distance in terms of what might be possible. And so it just always reminds me of kind of the significance in the moment to moment, in the everyday, in these small, what seemingly small acts and ways that we agitate, ways that we try to move toward or engage in social dreaming. And so, you know, I think that that's a little bit about, you know, how I think about what it means to kind of engage and move toward, you know, particular social futures in a way that doesn't leave or render, you know, any change or possibility like impossible, I guess.
Thank you, Natalie. It was just signaled by Arshad with the traditional the paper on this digital format that it's time for us to come to conclude. So thank you all as panelists and Lucy as co-organizer to be in conversation with us. As you've seen, this has been an ongoing conversation for us. It's a process of learning. It's raised a lot of questions and uncertainties more than it's taken us to conclusions and definitive places. But I do want to stress this tension that we were holding in terms of recognizing that in many ways these are some of the edges of the field, and yet they are core and center to who we are as human beings. So what does it mean to then exist in this tension and see the possibilities for us as a field? What does it mean for us to consider the theoretical and the methodological and the analytical edges or boundaries and the work that we need to do as a field in order to recognize what's core and human to us? So thank you all for being here and for engaging in conversation. And we look forward to having this conversation as a field moving forward as well.
Thank you, Thomas, and thanks to the whole group for this very nice invited panel. I will close now the session and maybe see some of you in the virtual gardens and also maybe in the yoga room. Bye-bye.